Good morning, everybody. It's our pleasure today to have Kelly Cobourn talking about the work she was doing while visiting also the chair last year. And Kelly is still in France, so it's an ongoing, I think, work. And we're happy to have you and also Philippe, who's your co-author here.
Great. Thank you for having me today. So I'll be talking today about work that I began with Phil Delacote about 4 months ago when I arrived in Paris on forest transitions and ecosystem collapse. And this is also joint with my colleague Greg Amaker at Virginia Tech and Haiyu Wang, who's a PhD student at Virginia Tech as well. And in particular, we'll be focusing on looking at the role of substitutability between primary and secondary forests in the analysis. Before I start, I want to extend a huge thank you. I was actually meant to come to France in fall of 2020, which was bad timing. It was still hard to get here this May. So I want to thank Phil and Anna for bringing me to the chair this spring. And then also Claire has been hugely helpful to me while I've been here, and many others, including the graduate students in the CEC lab who welcomed me at an awkward time. So it's really great to be here. So what I'll do is I'll start with an introduction where I'll talk a little bit about the differences between primary and secondary forests in tropical developing countries and why we think that these differences are important, both from an ecological and an economic perspective. I'll then talk a little bit about forest transition theory, which is something that Phil has worked quite a bit on and is one of the building blocks of this analysis. And then I'll talk about work that we've done to integrate the possibility of ecological collapse. So this is really sort of an area of my interest and modeling experience that I think has nicely dovetailed with Phil's work on forest transitions. So primary versus secondary forests. So you can see in this image here, okay, from the Brazilian Amazon, an example of primary forest on the left and secondary forest, which is planted to cassava on the right. So there are clearly some important differences between primary and secondary forests that we'll draw out in the analysis. So primary forests consist primarily of natural old growth, whereas secondary forests can either be regenerated naturally after cutting of primary forests, or they can be planted to plantations, such as this one, which is in cassava. Primary forests, as you can see, involve mixed species and mixed age stands. In contrast, secondary forests tend to consist of single species, even age stands that are harvested on relatively short rotations, sometimes as short as 10 years. Primary forests are an important source of a number of non-timber forest products, as well as opportunities for selective harvesting. Secondary forests, in contrast, provide an opportunity for intensive food and fiber production. So when we think about market goods, secondary forests are quite important from that standpoint. Primary forests, in contrast, are home to greater biodiversity. And recently, the scientific literature has shown that they offer many other ecological benefits, including, for example, lower ground temperature within the forest, which reduces the risk of fire. Secondary forests are home to relatively low biodiversity and higher ground temperatures and fire risk. Okay, so from an ecological standpoint, primary forests offer a number of benefits over secondary forests. And then finally, a point that I'll come back to throughout the presentation today is that there are important tenure costs associated with secondary forests. Okay. Typically in tropical developing countries like the Brazilian Amazon, land tenure is secured by clearing and improving land. Okay, so what that means is that when you deforest primary forest and put the land in agriculture, you're endowed with a property right that is relatively more secure. Typically, property rights are not awarded for investments in forest plantations. So individuals who choose to invest in forest plantations have to incur costs to guard against the risk of expropriation and illegal logging on their land. Okay. So those costs can be quite important in secondary forest systems. So we'll think about integrating those differences between primary and secondary forests with forest transition theory. So forest transition theory really originated with a model presented by Mather in 1992. And so the basic idea behind the transition model is that if you look at a country as a whole and think about the land area that's forested, so we're thinking about total forest cover, okay? Typically early in the economic development process, a country goes through a phase of pretty rapid deforestation. That phase is followed by a period of stabilization. And then we tend to see later on in its growth trajectory, an increase in net forest area. So this has been observed in a number of developed and still developing countries. So what happens is that you get this trajectory and a turning point, okay, which is the point at which we reach the minimum net forest cover in the country. So building on the work of Mather, there have been a number of models developed that look at competing land uses, primarily primary forest and agriculture. This is in the economic literature. And then also in economic literature that looks at this forest transition, okay, and understanding the drivers behind it and the roles of different factors like tenure costs in determining the turning point. Most of these papers have focused primarily on this deforestation phase and looking at the transition from primary forest to agriculture. The study that we'll be building most directly on is a recent extension to this literature by Wolfersberger et al. That looks at the role of forest type throughout the forest transition, as well as tenure costs. So what's important to note here is, again, we have the forest transition curve, okay? But what you can see here is that we have a change in the composition of the forest over time. As we engage in replanting efforts, we see more land planted to secondary forest, whereas the deforestation path can continue past the forest turning point, okay? So we can have an increase in net forested area, but that increase might be driven by putting greater land in secondary forests, while we still see deforestation of primary forest happening. So we'll be thinking about the role of forest composition throughout that forest transition, and also thinking about the role of this composition in providing ecosystem services that we think are important from an ecological standpoint. So there's also a large literature on ecological collapse, which of course originated in ecology. This is a simple ball and cup diagram, which I'm sure we've all seen before. Where we have a current state, which is in regime 1, and we might have an exogenous shock or some change in the system that leads to a loss of resilience. And what can happen is that the system can cross this critical threshold and go into regime 2, where vastly different ecosystem services might be provided. So one of the areas where we've seen this play out is in the Brazilian Amazon, where there's been increasing discussion about savannization of the system. So in particular, what is being observed currently in the Amazon is a shift from regime 1, which is a tropical forest, into a grassy savanna, which is regime 2. Okay. Once the system shifts into grassy savanna, it really can no longer be reversed back into tropical forest. And there's doubt about whether it can even support agriculture at that point. So we're looking at a dramatic change and loss in ecosystem services that support primary forests, secondary forests, and agriculture. So there has been a history of economic literature on ecological collapse, starting arguably with the work of Gordon and Schaefer on fisheries in the mid-1900s. In this case, they were looking at collapse and framing it as a problem of extinction in open access fisheries. Building on that work, there is a great deal of economic literature that looks at the potential for collapse, or also can be called thresholds or tipping points in ecological systems. So there's a great deal of literature that looks at different types of natural resource problems and the potential for collapse. There is also a growing literature that looks at the potential for collapse or tipping points in climate systems. Okay, so this literature started in the mid-1980s, arguably with Heel, and has continued to expand as we've seen systems collapsing due to changes in climatic factors. So what we'll be doing in this paper is combining these two areas of the economic literature. So we're really working at the intersection of forest transition theory with the work that's been done on ecological collapse points. We'll incorporate into our model concerns about forest composition, so this transition between primary and secondary forests, and then also the potential for tenure costs to arise in secondary forest systems. Our questions concern where is the forest turning point? Okay, so where do we get that minimum point in terms of net forest cover in the system? And what is the timing of that turning point in the system relative to the potential collapse point? Okay, so we're thinking about when does the collapse point potentially occur prior to the forest turning point? And what factors might increase the distance between the two? And then we're also thinking about how we might influence their relative timing with policy. So as I mentioned, this is a project that we only started 4 months ago, so we're still definitely developing results, and I'll be primarily talking about this first question today. But I think we already have insight that helps us to start to think about what types of policy instruments we might consider. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and start with a description of the theoretical model that we've developed for this problem. So the theoretical model really has 3 primary building blocks. The first is this concern about substitutability and imperfect substitutability between primary and secondary forests. We'll talk about integrating that into a dynamic forest transition model of the type that's been published. And then we'll incorporate the possibility for a collapse point. In this case, we're going to treat it as an irreversible and deterministic collapse point. Eventually, we would like to move to a stochastic transition point, but for now, we're starting with the deterministic, so a known ecosystem threshold. So the first component of the theoretical model is this ecosystem services production function that captures the contribution of primary and secondary forests to the production of ecosystem services. So what we want generally here is a function that articulates the relationship between the primary forest stock, the secondary forest stock, and the production of ecosystem services, while incorporating the possibility for imperfect substitution between primary and secondary forests. And we can think of ecosystem services as a general vector of different services here. So the approach that we've decided to take is to use a generalized CES production function to articulate this relationship. Okay. So the CES production function is of the standard form shown here, where alpha is our scale parameter, beta F and beta S are share parameters that capture the share of primary and secondary forests in ecosystem service production. And then rho is a substitution parameter that depends on the elasticity of substitution, sigma. What's really nice about this generalized CES production function is that it nests a couple of special cases, in particular the Cobb-Douglas production function, perfect substitutes, and Leontief production function as well. Okay, so we can look at a range of values for rho that are meaningful in that respect. So what we'll do is
just a question. On this kind of literature. So you take the stock as substitute. It means that there are no ecosystem services that are also related to the flow.
So I should clarify that what we mean by stock is land area that's in primary and secondary forests. So yes, this is the relationship that we're assuming is that it's a relationship between land area and ecosystem service production. We'll integrate the CES production function into the forest dynamic forest transition problem. So this is already published in the economic literature, but I'll give a brief overview of the important components that we take into account here. Okay. So there are 3 potential land uses: primary forest, secondary forest, and agriculture. We have our state variable, which is the land area in primary forest, capital FT. A second state variable for land area in secondary forest, ST. Okay. And then land and agriculture is given by the residual, okay, where we're assuming a unitary land base. We have an initial land area in each of the land uses as well, okay, that'll form the initial conditions in the dynamic model. We have two control variables, deforestation of primary forests and reforestation of secondary forests. We assume, which is consistent with the way this problem is set up, that deforestation is a one-way process. We're removing land from primary forests. This is land that's primary forests typically take hundreds of years to grow. So we're not considering regeneration of forests in this problem. Our change in land area and primary forest is given by deforestation. Similarly, we have reforestation of secondary forests, which is RT, okay? And the change in land area in secondary forest is given by reforestation efforts in each period. In primary forests, when we deforest, we earn one-time harvest revenues given by PF times the amount deforested, where PF is a vector of market prices for forest products derived from primary forests. We have a harvest rent function from secondary forests, which is concave, consistent with the literature, and then a land rent function for land and agriculture, which is also concave. Harvesting is costly, so we have a cost of deforestation function, and we have a planting cost function as well for land and secondary forests, both of which are convex. Okay. And then in addition, we have land tenure costs associated with secondary forests, which are given by the function phi of R, which is also convex. So these are the basic elements in the forest transition problem. Taking these elements, we can write the dynamic optimization problem that we're using to capture the forest transition. So the way that we frame this problem is that we have a land manager or social planner, okay, who is choosing a path of deforestation and a path of reforestation in order to maximize this objective functional. The objective functional includes ecosystem service benefits, which are given by this parameter theta times ecosystem service production. So the way that we're using the parameter theta is to look at the degree to which a regional land manager captures or takes into account the rents accruing from ecosystem services. So a theta of 0 would mean that your local or regional land manager is not taking into account at all those ecosystem service benefits. A theta of 1 would mean that they're fully captured at the local or regional scale. We have agricultural land rents, the profits from deforestation, secondary forest harvest rents, and then secondary forest management and tenure costs. We maximize this objective functional subject to our equations of motion governing the primary forest stock and the secondary forest stock, and the CES production function, as well as our initial conditions, F naught and S naught. So looking at this forest transition model, we can derive expressions that characterize the paths of deforestation and reforestation. These paths are similar to what was derived by Wolfersberger et al. In this recent paper published in Environment and Development Economics in 2021. And the results are similar in the sense that the paths of deforestation and reforestation depend on the relative rents in agriculture and the rents earned from ecosystem services provided by primary forests. For secondary forests, we also have secondary forest harvesting rents that affect the optimal path of reforestation. So what we add here relative to what's in Wolfersberger et al. Is the potential for these paths to depend on the parameters of the CES production function. In particular, to depend on the substitutability between primary and secondary forests. That substitutability matters, of course, as long as theta is not equal to 0. We can also use these paths to look at an expression for the turning point. okay, which is that minimum level of forest cover, okay, after which we see an increase in net forested area in a country. And similarly to what Wolfersberger et al. Show, this condition is going to balance the marginal value of forest cover against the marginal value of land conversion. And what we add here, again, are these expressions that bring in the potential for imperfect substitution between primary and secondary forests in ecosystem service production. So we'll show these results in a numerical simulation, but this is just a description of what's been added in this model relative to what's already in the forest transition literature. So the final piece that we want to add into this model is the potential for an ecological collapse point. So the way that we think about introducing this into the problem, again, this is a deterministic threshold, is that we'll specify some threshold level of ecosystem service provision, E sub min. When ecosystem service provision hits this level, we have system collapse, and we no longer have any ecosystem service provision after that point. So in other words, there's no salvage value in this problem once you cross this threshold. In all periods in the problem prior to hitting that threshold, it must be the case that ecosystem service provision exceeds that minimum level. In some free terminal period, capital T, ecosystem service provision can hit that level, E min. Okay, so this will determine the period in which we hit that threshold. Conceptually, what we're trying to do is to find the combination of primary and secondary forest that's associated with the isoquant defined by E min, the threshold level of ecosystem service production. So we can use our CES production function, plugging in the terminal period, capital T, to identify the bundle of primary and secondary forests that holds in that terminal time period. So using that isoquant associated with E min, we can rearrange the expression, okay, and optimize with respect to capital F of capital T, so the terminal primary forest stock. And in doing so, we can derive a free state transversality condition shown here, which basically requires that the ratio of shadow values of primary and secondary forest equal the marginal rate of technical substitution. We add to that a free time transversality condition. This is the typical formulation. The Hamiltonian must equal 0 in the terminal period of the problem. These conditions are going to define the other boundary condition that we need to solve the dynamic problem. So they define what happens at the end of the problem. So what we'll do is we integrate all of those pieces, and we're going to look at the results for an empirical simulation. So we're looking at an approach that involves numerical simulation, which we will parameterize to reflect conditions generally in the Brazilian Amazon at present. This could be parameterized to represent many different types of systems, but this is the system that we decided to start with. So a little bit about the approach that we use to the simulation. We're using a recursive solution approach, where we first use the transversality conditions that I just described to solve for our boundary values in the terminal period of the problem. Using those boundary values, we then solve a system of differential equations to determine the optimal paths of deforestation and reforestation. We parameterize the empirical model using quadratic rent and cost functional forms that are consistent with what was published by Wolfersberger et al. And parameters relevant to the Amazon case that are drawn from a number of different sources. Okay. And we've calibrated the parameters to reflect generally conditions that we currently observe in this system. So I'll go ahead and give an overview of the results. And I'll first talk about a couple of different decision-making scenarios that we can look at with the model, and then discuss a little bit of sensitivity analysis. So there's a lot going on in this slide that I'll walk through, but I want to start with the policy scenario. So we're starting in an initial case where the social planner recognizes the collapse point. And we're also going to assume that the social planner captures the ecological rents. Okay, so they care about the ecological rents in this case. And these are our initial parameter values in the CES production function. So what you can see in this top panel, okay, is the primary forest land area, which is the solid green line. Okay, so land area in primary forest is decreasing over time, which is the horizontal axis. The secondary forest stock, which is the dashed blue line, is increasing over time. And then the dotted black line is land and agriculture, which initially increases and then decreases as we start to see a gain in net forested area. The second panel illustrates the rents earned from primary forests, which is the green dotted line, which are decreasing in time. Rents earned from secondary forest, which is the blue dashed line, and agriculture, which is the black dotted line. The third panel illustrates the rates of deforestation and reforestation. And what's interesting about this panel is that this is the one that gives us the turning point, okay, where we see that minimum level of net forest cover, which is given by the intersection of these two curves. And in this case is time period 51. The final panel at the bottom, okay, I know these are small, illustrates the ecosystem service value, which is this blue dashed curve, and E-min, which is our ecological threshold. So this last panel tells us basically when we're hitting that ecosystem threshold or collapse point, which in this case is in period 77, which is 26 periods after the forest turning point.
When you say that the social planner recognizes the collapse point, it means that he's able to calculate it.
They know exactly what E-min is. So there's a deterministic number and they can look forward and anticipate when the system will hit that value. We have not incorporated the possibility for uncertainty in the threshold value yet. The second set of results illustrates what happens when you have what we're calling a myopic land manager who does not recognize the collapse point. Okay, so they're behaving as though there is no collapse point, or they don't know where that collapse point might be. They still care about the ecosystem service benefits yielded by primary and secondary forests, but we see some differences in the results here. So we can look, the forest turning point is in period 52, which is not much different than it was in the previous formulation, where they were able to anticipate the turning point or the collapse point. But we do see an advance in time in reaching the collapse point, which occurs in period 73 now instead of period 77. So this reduces the distance between the turning point and the collapse point. This third set of results illustrates what happens if the land manager does not recognize ecosystem service rents. So in this case, we're setting theta equal to 0. So we might anticipate that if none of the ecosystem service rents are captured at a local or regional level, that we'll see much earlier collapse in the ecosystem. And that is in fact what we see. We see an earlier turning point in period 40, but we also see a much earlier collapse point, which now occurs in period 38. Okay, so in this case, the collapse point occurs prior to that turning point in the system. We also look at some sensitivity analysis with respect to the parameters in the CES production function. So I've gone back to the initial scenario here where the social planner recognizes the collapse point, and they capture the ecosystem services locally. So theta is equal to 1. And we look at small changes in the substitution parameter and then a larger change in the substitution parameter. And then we also look at changes in the share parameter in the CES production function. So what we can see is that as the substitution parameter increases, we do see a decrease or a move forward in the turning point. Okay. And we also see that the collapse point occurs much earlier. So the amount of time as well between the turning point and the collapse point also decreases as that substitution parameter increases. The same pattern holds qualitatively for an increase in the share parameter, beta S. Okay. So we see an earlier turning point, an earlier collapse point, and a much smaller difference between the two as we increase substitutability in that CES production function. These results are still a work in progress, but I think they already yield some implications that give us some insight into the system. And definitely that also raised some new questions that we intend to look at over the coming months. So in terms of implications, I think we can already see some messages emerging from the model about turning points versus collapse points in these types of systems. So in particular, the forest transition literature to date has been concerned largely with the timing of the turning point, but not the collapse point. And what we're already seeing is that there are conditions under which the collapse point can precede the turning point. And so at that point, the turning point really is irrelevant because you're going to have ecological collapse occur first. The second main message that we can bring out from the results to date is that the timing of both the turning point and the collapse point depends on the interaction between a few different factors, namely the substitutability between primary and secondary forests, the relative land rents earned in the different uses, and then also how the ecological rents are viewed and captured by a local or regional decision maker. So some new questions that emerge from the analysis that we're really interested to explore further involve this question about global versus regional ecological rent capture. So there is reason to expect that local or regional land managers would not tend to capture all of these ecosystem service benefits, right? That's one of the arguments behind programs like REDD+, that if they don't capture these ecological benefits, that then it makes sense to set up policies to provide incentives or payments to compensate them for taking them into account. We also think that this degree of capture at a local level interacts with the substitutability between primary and secondary forests in potentially interesting ways. So this is a question that we would like to explore further. We, of course, would like to move to a model with an unknown or uncertain collapse point. It's much more mathematically complex, but also quite interesting. So we plan to move to a stochastic model in the coming months. And we'd also like to consider in greater detail the role of tenure costs as well as uncertainty in tenure costs. You know, in systems where enforcement is more costly, okay, we're going to see potentially earlier ecosystem collapse. So this is an important area that we'd like to look into further. And then finally, there are a number of different policies that we would like to consider. We know that we can potentially influence both the turning point and the collapse point by creating policies that target relative rent and cost differences between these land uses, including policies that influence tenure costs associated with secondary forest plantations. There's also the potential for policies that influence substitutability to play a role here. You could imagine policies that encourage different types of planting patterns or planting practices that would influence the degree to which secondary forests can substitute for primary forests in ecosystem service production. And then we think that there is still a role for primary forest protected areas that's quite important. So we often still see ongoing deforestation, okay, even in the presence of reforestation. And so we might think about putting into place some protection to prevent ecosystem collapse. So I will stop there and welcome any questions that you have now. And you can also feel free to contact either me at this email address afterwards, or I'm sure Phil would be happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you very much. I have a question on the policies that mentioned in the time that we just including. In practice, who is the authority that can do so? Is a national or an international one?
Put into place these policies? Yeah. Well, so certainly there's a role for international policy, like in the form of REDD+, for example. But there's also a role for national level policy that would potentially influence things like tenure costs.
And this is something that has been already observed in the past, or is something that states are reluctant to take, or?
I would say it varies quite a bit. I mean, there are examples of places where policies have been put in place at a national level, but there are also many examples of places where they haven't been. I think Brazil is an example of a place where there really haven't been. I mean, there have been some policies put in place to try to influence, for example, protected areas. But certainly there's opportunity for more policies to be put in place at a national level.
Yeah, because there is potentially a conflict of interest between what the state can do and what at the local level. In terms of yes, there are eco services, but there may be other incentive also to use the secondary forest. So
right.
And in the political economy, basically the rent from agriculture they tend to be overweighted because of their
local pressures,
conservation agencies involved with this.
Type of policy to understand that. So the type of policies you may try to test is whether by introducing a tax by unit of land created as a secondary forest, it will have an impact, or is it a way you want to analyze it by trying to determine whether there is an optimal taxation of secondary land?
I mean, we haven't even gotten to the point where we've defined precisely how the policy mechanisms would work. But yeah, I think there's an opportunity to consider lots of different types of policies that might include a tax as well.
Yeah, one option is basically increasing the cost of primary forest deforestation, which is the simplest one. But as you mentioned, the case of substitutability between secondary and primary forests is also determinant. So one might imagine something like maybe you want to increase the quality of secondary forests, like make it more diverse and closer to primary ones in order to for the one to compensate the other. And basically, you have on the one hand policies to reduce primary forest deforestation, and on the other one maybe increase the quality of secondary forests. Maybe that's the two types of policies that would make sense to compare.
And regarding the modeling, the fact that you, well, of course, you have already a lot of dynamics going on, and adding some uncertainty on the calculation of the turning point would be it's an additional layer of complexity. But I was thinking the link with climate change. So that's something that you can bring into the I don't know, into the ingredients of the model, because again, I'm not an expert, but the uncertainty related to climate plays a lot of important role.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could definitely integrate that into the model in the way that we introduce uncertainty in the ecological threshold. I think there's, emerging evidence that some of this is compounded, right? So like as you continue to degrade the system, you get greater variability in climate. And so I think those are things that we want to think about integrating into the model.
And another thing is that you also assume that the substituability is independent on time. So it is something that is fixed. But this is also something that is going to be affected by climate change, right? Oh, yeah, or not.
It potentially could be. I don't. That's a complicated
Mm.
dependence to integrate into the model framework.
But in any case, you
Mhm.
start modeling with a degree of substituability which is given,
Right.
and this is going to shape a lot of your
Right.
results.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a point well taken.
This ecosystem services function, and especially this collapse point, can also be related to resilience to climate change. You may say that when you reach mean or close to mean, you have something like the forest is not resilient enough to resist the climate change, and so it becomes more fragile and more less resilient. So you can also make this link between our ecosystem services function and the climate change in terms of adaptation.
Yes.
So potentially, this model could be used to produce different scenarios for NDCs, for example.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, I think you could put together a suite of parameter values that could represent many different types of systems, and that would be really interesting. An interesting way to use the models to look at, like what types of systems might we want to think about targeting if we're trying to prevent this type of ecosystem collapse.
A potential tool for national conversations about defining the NDCs.
Mm-hmm.
Because actually the red plus mechanism does not take into account at all this issue of the possibility of tipping points in the forest. So it's just a program for reforestation without targeting zones that are maybe more affected by this threat.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we take that into account. Now in the debate, there are people are more and more talking about the fact that reforestation may not be such a great solution because of the fact that basically it's very often monospecific forests that are replanted and that are not necessarily interesting neither in terms of ecosystem services nor carbon sequestration. There's been a paper recently published for India, which was showing that basically in terms of carbon sequestration, it was already no impact. So the debate now is more really on the fact that does reforestation has any points? And that's why I think this concept of the quality of reforestation makes sense. I think that this collapse point is being discussed by ecologists basically. Every summer when we see the fires in the Amazon, there are ecologists saying, well, maybe the collapse point will be reached probably. I'm sure. It's not necessarily in the policy.
What perhaps it is difficult to assess also in a, let's say, policy-friendly way. But it's a crucial point because, as you say, the debate is just reforestation for carbon compensation too. So I think that this is also the debate is also very focused on this idea without considering the global scale at which this happens. So,
yeah, in this type of debate, where is there space for the question of agroforestry, for example?
I don't know if this could be implemented in such a model, but basically it would imply that some ecosystem services could be brought also from agriculture, but we don't take it to account here. But if you say that within agriculture you have some agroforestry, then the third land use that we have, which is agriculture, also contributes. And so maybe we can make like some simple comparison with agriculture contributes or agriculture doesn't contribute to ecosystem services, and then compare and say that when it contributes, it's agroforestry.
I think I'm not on the ground. I'm asking that question from a political viewpoint because it's something that is currently being promoted by some sectors in agriculture in Brazil.
In terms of resilience, it makes a lot of sense.
And they have some private projects that show that you have a better quality, better resilience of the ecosystem if you reintroduce that with forest.
I think that it crucially depends on the location, no? Right? Because I mean, also if you could suggest something that is very wild, which is like Amazon, but forest is also something that we do have at a national scale. That is kind of trade-off maybe is more evident than the local scale.
When you compare agroforestry with reforestation, there is something that may be crucial is the quality of the land. Very frequently, when you consider reforestation, it's shown that it's on the land that is the less fertile because of the other one puts agriculture. But when you make some agroforestry, you use it on fertile land, and so the trees are growing up better than when you reforest in an area which is not very good.
Actually, the project in Brazil are using the reforest to bring back some form of agriculture that we improve the quality. It's more like restoration programs.
What's the reaction of the social planner when the collapse point is reached?
Well, once the collapse point is reached, there are no more ecosystem services, so the problem is over.
That is why we were saying that it's irreversible. So
Irreversible.
Yeah, so there are no policy or nothing that can be done.
Right.
And
that's, yeah, and that's, I mean, like broadly consistent with the ecological literature, like on lakes and other types of systems, is that it can, if it's possible to bring them back from regime 2 to regime 1, it can be also prohibitively costly. There's the concept of hysteresis, which is that you can't get back via the same path you went. And so that can be quite problematic.
So you mean the turning point?
EMIN is the collapse point. Okay. The turning point is the minimum level of forest cover in the system. So it's the point where you start to see an increase in net forest cover that's driven by reforestation activities.
So when you said that the social planner recognized the collapse point, what does it mean?
That they can anticipate when the system is going to hit that minimum level of ecosystem services, EMIN, after which there will be no subsequent ecosystem service production.
I think that when you say they anticipate, we all think about the that there are a way to model also expectation in here, but since it is deterministic, I mean, you can just calculate.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
there is an interesting economic literature that looks at learning over time, like agents begin to figure out where the threshold is, and they can update their behavior based on that learning.
But then regardless the fact that you can add some stochastic properties, then it means that you have to be more precise on the way in which the anticipation is made.
We've been talking about that on Tuesday because it's the week of seminar for Kelly. And
the Ross show.
And we are talking that when we introduce stochasticity, there may be some sense to have like something like a red flag, like, oh look.
Yeah, I was thinking an alert, something that
and that's what takes place now in Brazil and Amazon with all the fires. It's like the signal of maybe
a natural approach.
I don't know if there are questions online. Is anybody watching that?
Could I, hi, can you hear me?
It's you.
No.
in the parameters that you mentioned for the Brazilian Amazon, do they, if I understand well, they try to quantify like this ecosystem services
Mhm.
and their evolution, and do they take into account only like the local ecosystem services, but also visual knowledge like changes of weather patterns and their influence on plants in the regions, and so how is it to disposal?
That's a good question. My understanding is that we're taking into account the benefits that accrue more globally from ecosystem service provision. Mhm. And then that parameter theta is what we can use to tune how much of that is captured at a local or regional level.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, but it's not very loud.
So I haven't been able to hear any of the questions because of feedback in Zoom on mine, but I made out something about anticipating the collapse point.
Mhm.
It was discussed. And I just wanted to add that if you look at the open access literature and the arrival of an open access outcome as like a long run type of idea and equilibrium, I mean, typically the argument made is that people don't realize that rents are being driven to zero until it's too late. So I think already we're seeing in places where there are tropical forests that there hasn't been really any anticipation. It's almost been a myopic drive toward collapse, which is why I think the ecologists have gotten involved in saying that we're about to turn the Amazon into a savanna. So I'm not sure if like learning what would occur until the very end, and then it might not be enough to sort of prevent the collapse from happening. And certainly if the turning point hasn't happened at that point, I mean, there are big adjustment costs in trying to turn, tropical forests, trying to reach a turning point, given the conversion cost and the timber cost problem. Also, I heard something about land margins, but I don't really know what the question was, or something about agroforestry and land quality.
Mhm.
I think that we could sort of model that. In some ways, our tenure cost function incorporates the fact that there might be margins, and those margins might differ in terms of tenure, in terms of efforts to secure tenure. But in my mind, the margin changing that would happen through sort of land quality shifts would be small in relation to the large land sort of area changes between primary and secondary forests. So I think that the agricultural forest margin could change, and certainly has changed in places like India. But India is a situation where almost all of the native forests have already been deforested. So now the margins are going back. So again, if there were large margin changes between agriculture and forest, in my view, it would happen very late in the process, and not while we're deforesting the primary forest. Because if you look across the world, that has been the case, that there haven't been large changes in agriculture forestry margins, except for forests being deforested and agriculture expanding. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Greg. Any other questions?
Well, if not, thank you very much, and thank you also for being here during this strange period.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks.